Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
So just to start off, my name is Mary Newberger. I am the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies and a professor in the Department of History. And I am the co-host for Balkan Circle.
Thank you. My name is Kirill Avramov. Thank you, Mary. And I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. I'm also a co-host of Balkan Circle, and I'm excited as this Friday, as tradition already established, we are having an exciting and very interesting topic that will be discussed, and I certainly enjoy Victor's work, and I use it in my work as a political scientist. So history, is very important, and when we talk about path dependency today, I'm very much eager to ask you, Mary, to introduce our speaker, and we are to have the delight of listening to very interesting work that he has been doing.
Yeah, so it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Viktor Petrov, who received his PhD from Columbia University in the Department of History in 2017, and that's after receiving his BA and MA from Oxford University. He is currently an assistant professor of history at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, but it looks like this year in Sofia. Is that correct? And he specializes in the modern Balkans and the Cold War, history of technology. Research interests include the histories of information society on both sides of the Iron Curtain, the histories of failures and utopias is what you have on your website, but I'm sure your interests have evolved since then. But today he's going to talk about his very exciting book, which I've read cover to cover and I love dearly, and it's called Balkan Siberia, Cold War Computing, Bulgarian Modernization, and the Information Age Behind the Iron Curtain. It came out with MIT Press this year in 2023, and I'm sure it will win numerous book prizes. I'm sure of it, because this is really, I think, one of the best books that's come out in Bulgarian history ever. I mean, it's really amazing. Okay, so Victor, take it away.
Thank you. And seeing we're both going to be writing about Baba Vanga, thank you for jinxing me with this. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak here today. And yeah, I'll just jump straight in, I think, because we have about half an hour, 40 minutes to speak, right? Let's see. Share this. Can you see it? Does it work? Yeah. All right. So this picture, which already has appeared plenty of times, and was really pointed out to me by Mary, so I have to thank her for that, first of all. But I think it summarizes a lot about what the book is about. And, it's about a story of modernization. It's a story of utopia again and failure again, which are definitely, I think, dominating thoughts in quite a lot what I write about. I think my dream is still one day to write the history of Bulgaria through failure, which of course will make me many friends in Bulgaria, I assume. But I think it hangs behind this story as well. And I'm going to start with the story here because actually I'm currently reading in the archives about this part, future project. So in 1981, in the August 1981 from Plesetsk, which is about 800 kilometers north of Moscow, a rocket took off. And on top of that rocket was a satellite completely and utterly made in Bulgaria called Bulgaria 1300, part of this Intercosmos program for socialist space cooperation in space research. And this was part of this grand pageantry of the 1300th anniversary of the Bulgarian state, which was being celebrated in 1981. And it was meant to demonstrate amongst all these thousands of cultural events the scientific prowess of Bulgaria. And it was full of very computerized instruments, which were there to study the magnetosphere and the ionosphere. But importantly, it zoomed back in information which was recorded through the Soviet space program, through quite often Bulgarian computers, and definitely onto Bulgarian hard drives, which is the key of this story. Of course, as we well know, Bulgaria, much like other Balkan states, just a generation before, was 85% agrarian. One of its main products were agricultural, tobacco, of course, being one of the big cash cows, as again Mary's written about. In many ways, the story really started for me in this one of the strands. Why I thought about this is how do you get from number one to number two? These two pictures, right? In one generation, how do you get from Bulgaria being a fairly typical example of what economists in the 40s and 40s thought about as backwardness, some of these, nascent works of international development were being developed by looking at the Balkans. How were they by the 70s and 80s producing computers, equipping the Eastern Bloc, and also in some ways modernizing society in many ways? The other strand of why I decided to write about this is in many ways because of childhood. Well, I mean, everything I write about is probably about childhood trauma and dealing with it. And I don't mean trauma, real one, but like this stuff that you hear about as a child. In Bulgaria, one of the narratives you might hear at the dinner table or whatever is, did you know that the Bulgarian created the first computer? And, they'll tell you when you're 8 that, his name was Jonathan Asov, for example. And that name sounds Bulgarian to a child. So I was thinking, well, what is the truth to all this? Who is Jonathan Asov? He is this American inventor. But as you can see, this monument stands in the middle of Sofia, quite close to the National Theatre. So he's, immortalized in some of this the Bulgarian narrative as some kind of example that Bulgarians somehow created the computer, or at least had a hand in the creation of modern computing. The other thing is that there's lots of lived narratives of the post-socialist world and the post-socialist Bulgaria, including personal narratives. On the right is my father, who was completing a PhD in artificial intelligence in 1989, which he abandoned after false socialism. But these kind of skills and the human capital that he was part of allowed these strands of this history of technology to bridge the 1989 gap. And I think that this book is also trying to talk about the fact that we can't talk about post-1989 Bulgaria without tracing some of the strands from before that.
Wait, Victor?
Yes?
For some reason, your slides are not advancing for me. I don't know about for others.
Are they not?
I'm still seeing the first one.
The title.
Yeah. Is that where I'm not seeing your second slide, or I see it small over on the left side.
Let's see. They're not
You know
moving.
what
Let's try it again.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
Let's try it again.
Like it's fixated on the first slide with the smaller slides to the left.
Is it moving now?
Yes, perfect. Okay.
So do you see a satellite?
Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the
Okay.
satellites. We've talked about these pictures, the women's harvest, the apple
Okay.
harvest, right? And sorry, this is the picture. That's the third picture. Jonathan Asov was a monument, and on the right, my dad, which he's of course going to be very happy now that he's been seen in another presentation. So we're going to move to the next. See this one, right? This slide, just making sure that it's working. Okay. Yeah. So some of the things that I was reading, both as I was doing the dissertation, as I was turning into a book, I think intervention in a number of fields. First of all, I was inspired by books such as by Dr. Neuberger and Dr. Mihili, obviously Balkan and Siberia in some ways, and not to Balkan smoke, and this idea of commodity and what commodity histories can tell us, not just about Bulgarian history. And I'm not trying to do a long durée Bulgarian history, I'm trying to do more of a deep, for one period, it's a deep one in that sense. And of course, the computer is slightly different to tobacco, as it's much more of a tool as well as a commodity. But that inspiration was quite key to, it gave me like an impetus to look at Bulgarian history for things that I might not have appreciated before. Was it very influenced also by the book by Dr. Mihili on Albania and the socialist world, which really made me think about the socialist world as much more of an alternative modernity project. Of course, while this book was being written, in many conversations with Theodora Dragostinova also helped, which is also another in this slew of history of socialist Bulgaria and its globalization in the 70s, right? Where she writes about the cultural diplomacy and the cultural offensive of the late 70s and early 80s, of which that satellite is actually an interesting subset. Frankie Goes to Hollywood is not obviously a history book, but I'm just using it to illustrate this tendency in Cold War history to look at the post-60s, it's post-late 60s socialist world as this senile Cold War, this time of Brezhnev, the time of, the Frankie Goes to Hollywood is about Chernenko fighting Reagan, when it seemed to the senile Soviet leaders were in charge. This is a trend I've seen also in some of this new emerging histories of alternative globalizations, the works by James Mark, etc. And I am not convinced that the late 70s and 80s were such a senile Cold War. And just because that you don't have people like Khrushchev trying to advance a particular view of international relations doesn't mean that states, especially small states, can't do very interesting things, especially if you look at it through the prism of technology, which brings us to the last picture, which is Cybersyn, the Chilean socialist project under Allende in the 70s to create a democratic socialism through cybernetics and computing, right? This is an attempt which failed, of course, because of Pinochet, but probably would have failed anyway in some ways. But it was written beautifully in this award-winning book from Baden Medina. And this kind of inspired me years ago to think about computers as not just obviously a tool to look at Bulgaria, but maybe just to look at also the philosophy and social impact of all this. Why Bulgaria, why computing is probably how to get more to move beyond the historiography. I think some of us are obviously familiar with the story, some of us who have been made to read this book many times by now in various drafts forms. But for most of people, I think this story is incongruous and it's definitely unknown. So Bulgaria, as I said, like this country, which in some ways was also assigned an agricultural breadbasket role in the 1950s in the Eastern Bloc division of labor, by the late or mid 80s was producing and capturing about 47% of Eastern Bloc electronic trade. It was producing computers at such a high rate that the Spiegel in 1982 actually estimated 70% of all electronics in the Eastern Bloc were Bulgarian, which is wrong, but I think also shows you an awareness in the West at that time that Bulgaria was punching well above its weight in the Eastern Bloc and was equipping vast swaths between Berlin and Vladivostok. It equips high-tech things like the Soviet space program, which I'm using as just one example, but it also is equipping high-tech and laboratories for oil exploration, for navigations, nuclear research, not just in the Eastern Bloc, but about in 54 countries throughout the global South as well, from Egypt and Iraq and many of the Middle Eastern countries to Vietnam, to China, to India, which is my case study, Cuba, and sub-Saharan African countries like Mozambique and Angola. So in that way, the Bulgarian computer is, while born in the Eastern Bloc, is exported in many other ways as well. There's a domestic impact on this as well. It creates the second biggest industrial workforce after the steel and iron workers put together. It's so about 11 to 13% of all industrial workers depends, who is counting, how you're counting in Bulgaria, are in this electronics industry. So about 200,000 workers in the country, about 8 million people. And it creates things like the biggest hard drive factories and biggest electronic factories in the Eastern Bloc. That's the picture of the Stara Zagora factory. And it's under the purview, by the late 80s, it's creating something that's akin to a supercomputer, which I think Americans at that point, they were so amazed it even exists that they sent teams from the Los Alamos laboratories to come and check them up in the last days of perestroika. So I think in that sense, I think I'm trying to prove that this is an extremely important story. And it's extremely important as a cash cow as well, which is why it's created, which is where this book starts. And it's created by the guy here, Ivan Popov, in some ways. He is a very well-connected, Western-trained engineer, power engineering, not electronic engineering, but also extremely savvy and extremely well-connected. He has communist credentials, is what I'm trying to say. He's very much aware from the 50s that Bulgaria needs to solve a crisis and has a possibility to solve this crisis in front of it. And this crisis and this possibility plays out only in the logics of Comecon, the Eastern Bloc's mutual aid, economic aid organization, which, as you can see, already gives an in to the global world as well, beyond the USSR. But even if only the USSR was there, that's already a potential market of 250 million people and a central economy which is needing a lot of computers. Bulgaria, by the late 50s, is undergoing still breakneck Stalinist industrialization, and it's all these kind of hallmark industries, heavy industries are popping up: steelworks, coalworks, power engineering. People are obviously moving from the land to the cities as part of the collectivization, as part of like some of the draws of urbanization. But all this is being financed by a big deficit. So by 1958, 1959, Bulgaria is facing its first financial debt crisis of the socialist period. And this time it owes money to banks, Soviet banks quite often, but not just them, but Soviet banks which are based in Western Europe, so have to go by different rules. So the party is aware that it needs to find some kind of export good with high value added. At the same time, it's aware, and Ivan Popov is aware, especially if he managed to drive this point in the Politburo, that after Stalin's death, Comecon is actually going to start functioning, because under Stalin it was more really on a piece of on paper. The idea of Comecon in the 60s is to divide up specializations between all the Eastern Bloc states. And so with our joint efforts, we can overcome and vary capitalism. So not like the Poles and the East Germans should, concentrate in different things. The Bulgarians should concentrate in different things, etc. So if the specializations are coming, you have to, by the 60s, offer, why you should be given specialization. And Ivan Popov is very much aware of this, and he's very much aware that also there's no mass-produced computing anywhere in the Eastern Bloc. There are, of course, computers in the Eastern Bloc. The Soviet Union is producing them. However, they're mostly tied to the military and space programs, right? At the same time, Bulgaria, much like all these countries, is also facing the problem of the end of extensive growth, right? This breakneck Stalinization has kind of absorbed all the surplus labor from the land and is reaching the limits of how much productivity is getting out of each worker. So everyone is scrambling for how to get more productivity out of everyone in this future to intensify the economy. And the computer suddenly comes into this as the perfect good for all of that. Ivan Popov manages to convince the Politburo we can leapfrog the Germans and the Czechs, let's say, if we move fast. This is also a good with massive high value added to the money. It'll create huge profits for us, especially if we concentrate in the extremely banal things like the hard drives, because hard drives, everybody needs a lot of hard drives, because obviously this is a time of 7 megabyte hard drives and redundancy. The Soviets are also buying many more than they need because of the logics of nuclear war. Right, a nuclear blast, a magnetic blast would wipe so many out of the information off. So Ivan Popov convinces the Politburo to invest, and they do that. They do that in the early 60s, and they do that through some extremely good maneuvering through Popov himself, but also in other ways, which I'll talk about in a little bit. First of all, you need to mass produce these computers, hard drives. Do you do it on your own, or do you get a license? And of course, we're operating in the Cold War, where Bulgaria, much like the Soviet Union and all the socialist countries, are under an embargo from the West, right? But there is one kind of hole in the armor, and that seems to be Japan, and because of its new foreign policy and new business policy in the 50s and 60s. And Bulgaria has this massive obsession, again, with Japan from the 60s onwards. Ivan Popov himself manages to ensure that the head of Fujitsu, the kind of conglomerate of Fujitsu, which is also producing computers by the 60s, visits Bulgaria on his first tour of Eastern Europe, and it's also the first tour of a Japanese scientific industrial magnate in some ways of the Eastern Bloc. They strike a friendship, and once he secures the money from the Politburo, Popov reaches out to Secundevada and basically manages to secure the first Eastern Bloc license from anywhere from the West or from the capitalist world to produce computers. These are pictures just to show the Bulgaria Expo 1970, which also is slightly later than the license, but also captures the imagination of the Politburo, especially Zhivkov himself, the communist leader, who travels there and really struck by Japan as a model of success. In his memoirs, which of course have to be taken not just with a pinch of salt, but with maybe all the salt in the world, like he talks about it, that's maybe when he was being convinced that socialism might not work, but whatever the truth is, there was this obsession and link to Japan and Japanese high technology from the 60s. And on the right is the Fujitsu Company song, which was actually published by Balkanton. And I think that's I think that might be the only company song that I can see Balkanton ever creating vinyls of. And I think that shows you how Fujitsu and how important Fujitsu was in the mindset of Bulgaria at that point in the 50s. And so this allows this industry to take off. Bulgaria starts producing these domestic produced calculators, the Elkas from the 1960s, which are his first success. And they're also extremely good training regime for like engineers. But the main real coup is the 1965 license of these huge computer centers. Of course, we're talking about the 60s where computers were the size of rooms. And it's not even so important that the Bulgarians got the license to produce them. That they got the links to train so many engineers, and it was the first kind of real mass movement of Bulgarian computer electronics engineers beyond the Eastern Bloc, and they were being trained in Fujitsu's factories, which made them at the cutting edge. So in 1965, 1966, when the specializations really come on board, and when the Comecon starts really dividing up specializations, these Germans and the Czechoslovaks, to their massive surprise, find that the Bulgarians have actually kind of leapfrogged them in some ways, right? And they're probably don't feel very good about it, but they get it. And Bulgaria gets massive specializations, and mostly in the hard drives and floppy drives and memory devices, which, as I say, is what's extremely important. That's what Ivan Popov has said we should focus on, and that's what really gets the Bulgarians billions and billions of profits over the next couple of decades. They create processors in this system, Vizot. Vizot is the conglomerate. of recording, organizational, technological devices, which combines all the factories and research instruments, and it's very boring history, but it's a very important history of how Bulgaria organizes institutionally the production of these computers. And by the early 80s, it's also producing private personal computers, robots, and all kinds of devices for like the next stage of the electronics revolution. So this is a very short overview of what it's producing and how important it is, and how this all takes off by the 70s massively. Of course, Japan is only one part of the story, because in the next chapters, of course, the main question stands to, okay, Popov has decided, the people around Popov have agreed with him that Bulgaria needs electronics, that managed to secure one license. But how do you build an electronics industry when you have no previous experience of it, when you don't really have experience of electrical power engineering very much either? And while the Japanese provide a part of the story, the real big story in some ways is state security, right? And state security and scientific technical intelligence directorate, which of course all state security systems have. So I don't think it's a surprising story, and I don't think it's a story that should be, and actually it's the first time I ever presented any of this, about many years ago now, I presented precisely parts of this chapter, and I had a person in the audience who worked for the U.S. Department of Defense, had worked for the U.S. Department of Defense. Like, that's what everyone does this. So like, I'm not surprised, and this is not something that should be seen as either licit or illicit. The Cold War, the two things seem to connect so much that there's, when you're in an embargo, illicit and licit can fall out the window. This book is, I'm just using it to demonstrate, this book is extremely prized because it's by a Bulgarian author who didn't get the rights to have 007 in his spy novel, so he calls him 07, and he's defeated by one of the Bulgarian super spies, Avakum Zakov. I haven't checked on eBay. The last time I checked a few years ago, it was going for like 635 British pounds. So if you obviously, if you have a copy of this lying around, you can make some money. But the real Avakum Zakovs of Bulgaria were not fighting James Bond because they were not interested in military and political secrets as much as, let's say, the KGB was. And from the very early stages of the setting up of this directorate, you see these constant reports where the Soviets sometimes are criticizing the Bulgarians of going, well, you're not providing almost no military secrets, while we're supposedly in this Cold War confrontation with capitalism. Well, the Bulgarians already from 1964, 1965 in the organizational documents are saying, we don't care. Or basically, like, we have a limited resources, and the importance for us is the civilian economy, right? And the state security intelligence, scientific intelligence arm has to focus on what the economy needs. And by the 80s, it's basically almost it is the research arm of the electronics and some other high-tech industries, right? If you look at the documents, the operational records, they're basically lacking because they were burned most likely in 1990, but a lot of the organizational, institutional, dry numbers remain to show you that in some countries, some years, over 50% of all informations, as they call them, gathered were in electronics, outnumbering every other industrial, agricultural, scientific sector put together, which I think shows you the importance of this industry to Bulgarian policy. And even more so by the 70s and 80s, it's creating these institutes in order to encompass so many of its scientific workers of Bulgaria who might not even be knowing that they're working to evaluate state security information. So actually, by the 1980s, over 7,000 people are involved in evaluating informations and helping create the plan for state security itself. So that's one way of how you can see that state security is not encapsulated in its own little world. It's actually encompassing as an information around large swaths of like the technological intelligentsia, and it actually has massive coups. The only real surviving document I've seen about a single operation is 1977, where they managed to buy a whole factory, probably by IBM in Portugal, for magnetic drives. Portugal has just undergone its carnation revolution, so American companies are pulling out because they're aware that maybe a communist government might come in. Bulgarian state security sweeps in and basically has to charter one Boeing from Spain, 2 18-wheelers, and even a diplomatic car to smuggle so much stuff out of there, to transfer it almost all back to the Bosphorus. And I think this really gets to another point of the book, which is where is the Iron Curtain, who is it for, and how porous is the Iron Curtain actually, which I think is one of the main interventions of the book. The other intervention, I think, is to zoom out and not just think about the Bulgarians or whoever in the Balkans as being encompassed just in their geopolitical blocks, but as being part of probably what's much more important in the Cold War. I don't know what's that's a big debate, of course. But in my view, almost obviously the decolonization of the world is a much more important thing in some ways that happened in the late 20th century. And Bulgaria obviously uses this as a way to open to the world as well and also make money. India is my case study for practical reasons, language reasons, but also for the reason that after the sign of Soviet split, India becomes the biggest Asian goal of Bulgaria, economically and in terms of international relations. It's also the country which Bulgaria has the most probably intense high-level diplomatic relations in the 70s and 80s in the global south. And very quickly, Bulgaria tries to place its computers there. India itself has its own policy around electronics, much more connected to its problems with unemployment, its problem with its rapid growth of its workforce, but also protectionism. It's a very highly protectionist country, which still, in the early years of this project that we're talking about until the early 70s, is a place where Bulgarians, without having to worry about going to the USA or to the UK, can see what IBM are doing, can see what the British are doing, can see what the Japanese are doing without COCOM. That's extremely important because it becomes this playground in some ways, where Bulgarians can meet the first world on the grounds of the third. But when they're trying to sell, they also quickly find out that they have to do things differently. In Comic-Con, things depend on contracts, 5-year plans, quota systems, right? Indian enterprises, Indian universities, Indian ministries can buy from IBM. They can buy from Fujitsu directly. They don't have to buy from the Bulgarians because of some agreement on a high level. And very quickly, the Bulgarian embassy in places like India becomes one of the biggest critics of the Bulgarian electronic industry, telling them they're basically just really, really bad at their job. You're selling us computers with Russian keyboards. You're selling us sloppy, aesthetically designed things. How are you going to you have no idea who to focus on in terms of business negotiation. And over the 70s and 80s, you see this kind of criticism and this kind of experience in countries like India feed back into Bulgarian marketing, Bulgarian advertising, developing different ways of advertising, developing different ways of business negotiation, including with some very shady Indian businessmen like Adil Shariar, who is a story which we can talk about separately, but he's highly embroiled in corruption. But of course, you can probably make an argument that that's really the best way to learn business negotiation in some ways. So by the 80s, India is not just a place where Bulgarians are placing computers and making some money in hard convertible currency, but I think more importantly, it's another part of the story of how under socialism, there were like these islands of capitalist thinking or market thinking already through the lived experience of hundreds or maybe even more of foreign traders and engineers. But at some point, of course, I got tired of talking about Bulgaria and the world, and I decided to see what's happening in Bulgaria. And Bulgaria was obviously thinking about what to do with those computers, because computing is not just a cash cow, and especially not by the 70s when you've trained hundreds of thousands of people not to work with them. It's also by the 80s a thing that's being promised to change everything about society and the economy, right? Bulgarian robots are being produced by the 1980s. These computers are being put into networks themselves. And this has recently been written, or a few years ago, has been recently written about by Benjamin Peters, for example. He wrote this great book, How Not to Network a Nation, about the Soviet internets and these dreams from the early 60s of automating at least accounts, but also economic planning in the USSR. A failed project, but however, one which produced imaginaries or dreams for the Soviet Politburo, but also vast swaths of Soviet society. And Bulgaria had its own version of that. This KESI network, which was supposed to link, and it did link computers from the collective farm to territorial centers in the provincial cities to Sofia itself, which is supposed to streamline accounting of what's happening with the quota fulfillment, identify shortages and bottlenecks in the system, and allows the central plan to be fulfilled, or at least planned better. Of course, by the 80s, very much, even the Politburo is aware that, as they say, actually in the speech, KESI is lying to them, because obviously it doesn't eliminate the problem of false numbers or who enters the numbers into the spreadsheets and the databases, right? How can you really plan perfectly if the numbers are imperfect because of the humans who are creating them in that way, right? But it shows you some of the promises that the party thought about. This was a promise for them for many years of non-market reform, right? The economy was stagnating. They were aware that there were problems with the command economy, but somehow robotization and automatization and cybernetization in their head and networking would have solved it in some way, shape, or form. especially the problem of quality production, because unlike the Bulgarian worker, in their head, the Bulgarian robot is the perfect worker, right? He doesn't sleep on the job, he doesn't bill for this petty change, etc., etc. So this vanguard of the proletariat party, unsurprisingly, by the 70s, is actually looking at computers as somehow the thing that can solve their problems with the proletariats who are not producing well enough. Once the personal computer revolution happens, and this is the Pravets, which you can see from its kind of glossier adverts, is definitely a far cry by the 80s of earlier computers and earlier ways of advertising it. The Pravets open up a whole different possibility because you're not just automating shop floors anymore. We can talk about how automated the shop floors were. That's, as you can say, I'm still staying more in the land of dreams here. The personal computer, as you can see, opened up a land, a whole galaxy, as this picture. A promise to open up a whole galaxy to workers, to children, to mothers. We'll talk a bit about the gender aspect, which I think in this book, sadly, it's very much on the side. This promise to enter like the everyday life of workers, and it results in this veritable intellectual explosion, I would say, right? Philosophers, teachers, pedagogues, economists, engineers themselves, who sometimes previously in the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, you can read their extremely dry reports on tractor optimization. By the 70s, are writing philosophy tracts, etc., in the philosophy journals and also in popular magazines aimed at children. And children especially become one of the cores of the ideas of what computers can do, right? The new generations gonna grow up with the computers, but potentially computers could enter your day-to-day life, could help you put the right soap in the water, as this caricature again, with this very specific gender dimension shows. And Amadeus, I'm putting up there because it's one of the most interesting of the philosophy tracts that I found around computing, which actually connects to Zhivkova. All this in some ways, we can talk about that as well. A philosopher talks about the fact that if you want to be Mozart or Amadeus, you have to basically be reborn billions of times because he's a freak of nature, right? But you can be Salieri, because Salieri is not a tragic or a bad figure, but he manages to break down all the points of music, like harmony or counterpoints, into the specifics, and processing enough information and practicing enough, he manages to approach the genius from Salzburg. So again, computers are very, very good at that, systematizing and also processing. So maybe computers are our way to true creativity. What the implications of saying that you should be Salieri rather than Mozart for the whole Bulgarian mediocrity during socialism is a whole different thing, but he doesn't address that, right? But of course, there are responses to all of this as well, practical responses. When you're automating in a shortage economy, you kind of take away some of the logics of how people operate in that shortage economy. And this is very much hard to get into in the archives, but for interviews especially, I'm going to use one of the examples, the automation of a copper mine. Here on the left, you can see a still from a documentary, set very nice electronic music, which shows how this automated system was supposed to work in one of the open air mines, quarries for copper in Bulgaria, where before the automation system was created by Bulgarian engineers, the truck drivers who were going to particular sites were being dispatched there by central dispatch posts, often manned by what the engineers saw as either their girlfriends or very close friends, who would quite often either put up like phantom loads or send their favorites to particular better places to fulfill the quota quickly. These people come in, automate all this through a central dispatching computer, which relays all the information to the trucks or collects information on the truck through like intermediary radio posts. And within a few weeks, they get a call from the mine to say that the system stopped working. Dispatch someone, and they see that most of these intermediary radio lines between the computer and the trucks are all broken. And they ask the drivers, they're like, oh, in the night, sometimes we don't see them. They have no lights on them. So we just kind of like hit them sometimes. And we're so really sorry. Of course, they're very much aware of what that potentially means. And so they armor them, and then the system works perfectly for a few years, right? So you can see why maybe automation was not in the interest of how people operated in this kind of quota-driven economy of the 70s and 80s. Yes, towards the end, I want to highlight certain other aspects of how computing promised a lot of things, but potentially didn't engineer much or fed certain anxieties which are still with us today. Psychological anxieties about job loss or addiction or surveillance, etc. And this is mostly for the gender, which I only really saw in some of the articles, mostly in the magazines, The Woman Today, Jeanette Ness. First of all, the majority of the workers putting together the computers on the electronic conveyor belts are women, right? And a lot of the processors, the people literally called processors in the computer centers themselves, are women, technicians, and highly qualified ones, right? And when you go towards some of these promises of what the computer revolution is supposed to bring the woman as another part of society, which is supposed to be brought into the bright future, you can see how it runs up against the supposed promises of the regime. First of all, you can see the spread. These are the four faces of the modern Bulgarian woman, apparently, but you can still see the quite conservatively traditional, the ballerina, the nurse or his mother. But the electronics worker has certainly appeared there as well. Once you read the articles, what they're saying is the personal computer now has actually made it worse for us, because before we have this extremely generous 3-year maternity leave. And that was, when we worked in these large computer centers in the 70s, we had to be given our maternity leave. But now our bosses and the regime is basically saying, well, that doesn't matter anymore. You can still have your maternity leave, but it doesn't mean you can't produce anymore, because we can furnish you a personal computer. So while you're literally, that's one of the quotes, like while you're breastfeeding, you can still program, right? So there you go. The imperative of production, software production by the 80s is overcoming the other, like some of the other supposed utopian visions of the regime, which is they're supposed to be obviously a champion of women workers, but actually the worker part is becoming much more important, it seems like, and the computer is feeding into that. But this is something that I've only highlighted, and as Mary knows, I have not really delved as much deeply into it. And I think this is only one of the many strands which I think should be picked up by someone. And actually, just generally in Eastern Bloc computing, the gendered aspect is not really being explored. And it's actually to be fair, it's not being very well explored in the Western computing literature either. To push it towards the end, other things that I wanted to look at, because I read all of this when I was a teenager, like science fiction, and obviously my dream is to shoehorn this into a legitimate academic career, are the novels and comics and the other expressions of popular culture around computers, and read them, and as maybe showing us something about these anxieties and dreams, right? How did people in some ways approach this? Because the children were not just going to computer classes, they were reading works like this. And Bulgaria, if per capita was the third biggest producer of robots during the 80s, it was definitely the biggest per capita producer of robotic laws. After the famous three ones of Isaac Asimov, Bulgaria produces the fourth and fifth in the 70s and 80s in science fiction and comic novels, which I think show you both the pessimistic and the positive, optimistic view by certain intellectuals, because both of these people are intellectual. Luban Dilov is a writer with very high renown in Bulgaria, while Kisarovsky himself is a mathematician who worked in the industry and then became a popularizer of science, kind of like mini Bulgarian Carl Sagan, that kind of stuff. So they're educated and important people in that sense. Dilov sees all this as an anxious world, and where actually if robots, we need to distinguish ourselves from robots, because we don't trust robots. And like, are we robots? And that's for him, in his very humanistic view, is bringing up very problematic reasons for what the future of humanity is. Well, Kisarovsky is basically saying we are actually robots anyway, right? So a robot must know it's a robot. And if we can accept that, then we can build a cybernetic future anyway, right? We can actually not feel so anxious around our computers and our machines. By 1989, Lyubomir Nikolov adds 100 satirical ones in a 2-page short story, and the 101st law of robotics states that if anyone makes a robot learn any more rules, should be beaten on the head with 200 volumes of Asimov's work, which I think is his reaction to this constant obsession of the party. I'm coming to the end, and I think we don't have that much time, but I think it's things we can raise in the questions. The post-socialist aspect, I had to take a more cautious approach with, because a lot of these people are still alive. But a lot of the people who traded or in the highest echelons of the party and were connected to the computer industry also have trajectories beyond 1989. And this gets into the story, I think, of the delayed transition towards capitalism, or how do you make capitalists without capitalism, and how does cultural and economic power get translated into political power in the 90s, etc. Some of these people were candidate members of the Politburo. Stoyan Markov is the last head of Bulgarian science, basically the last person in Ivan Popov's shoes, who basically disappears in 1989 to London and only comes back in the 2000s around some interesting deals with the potential deals with the Bulgarian Socialist Party, which is in power or in coalition power by then. I interviewed him in his office in the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, where he is obviously an extremely astute person, but Also, it's interesting when you start putting things together of who can liquidate companies in 1989, connected state securities, people like him, who can, on a Bulgarian Academy of Science, wage, he's living in a penthouse above Sergei Stanishev, the ex-prime minister. Like, so it's interesting, these kind of stories have, or this kind of story kind of accelerated people's careers in certain ways and made capitalism, different. But also tens of thousands of much less well-placed engineers also made this move in different ways. And I want to end on one of the last groups that made the move in some ways is, I think, the Bulgarian viruses, which I'm just using as one of the other codes to the book, right? Because leave aside these high-placed Politburo members or directors of personnel computer factories, by the 80s, Bulgarian children were, being promised that the regime kind of was looking towards them as the promise of the future, as the people who would have the second computer literacy and maybe be able to produce kind of the breakthrough in software that might actually automate our industries, etc. What actually these kids, a lot of them produced was viruses. By 1989, 1990, 90 out of all 300 viruses for IBM were produced in Bulgaria. But John McAfee, of very infamous fame, when back in 1990, when he was still mostly dealing with antivirus rather than, gallivanting around Brazil taking drugs, talked about the fact that most of the calls he got were for Bulgarian viruses, right? And the hacker community and this thing, I think it can also be seen as an expression of creativity, especially in conditions of shortages, right? These kids were being promised something, they're being promised something and they didn't have access to it because so many of these computers were almost always just on the pages of these magazines, or they were being exported to the Soviet Union, or they're only available in the computer classrooms or the states union, youth unions run clubs, which of course not everyone has access to. So in that way, even when you read some of the interviews, they literally thought this was our way to travel beyond the Iron Curtain. Something I made traveled. Like these are viruses which literally said made in Sofia in 1989. It's almost like a mark of respect, mark of hope. And so I think in that sense, that's where I want to end the story in the book on, like, as a story, it's a story of failure. The hardware is gone. No factories produce this, but the human capital definitely on both the highest and the middle and the youth level. Of course, these are not youths anymore. Progressed and continued, and you can't really talk about Bulgaria's economy or Bulgaria's politics today without this as well, I think. So I'll stop here because I think that's about 40 minutes. And yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Victor. I love this presentation. I have lots of questions. I'm sure Kirill does too, but I'm not really sure where to start. But one question kind of came to mind, and that is, like, when you were talking about your dad, and I can't remember if we've had this conversation, but my dad was also a computer programmer. He worked for IBM, actually, and then he worked for some different banks. And so as a kid, we would go and see the mainframes and the punch cards, and he would bring home computer paper for us to use as scrap paper, But then when he turned, I guess, 60, he was sort of forced into retirement because you were just talking about human capital. I was thinking about obsolescence because, on the one hand, a lot of the heavy industry from the region we can think of as becoming obsolete. But as you said, also the hardware and the computer technologies become obsolete. But the human capital, I think, can also become obsolete in a sense, because eventually, at 60, it's like, sorry, we're going to go for the youngsters. You know what I mean? Like, you have also become like kind of obsolete in terms of the trajectory of knowledge around computer networking and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know if like that just sort of the general discussions of obsolescence come into sort of discussions in the computer industry, or if you could sort of talk about it in general over this trajectory. But I guess in addition to obsolescence, I was also just thinking about like subjectivity, like people, individual experiences of people who've lived through this computer age, or who grew up when there was no computers, and have kind of lived through these like radically different phases of possibilities in the computer age. Like, what is that, sort of, I don't know if, I think we're still trying to understand, like, how does this change people's brains? Like, how do, but But I wonder if you thought about that in the sort of the Cold War context and also the transition. Sorry, two huge questions, but
Yeah, obsolescence of people. So that's a good question, and so the I guess the good thing about this is that they didn't really have the time to become obsolete because the first cybernetic expert in Bulgaria was trained in 1958, and the classes only really started in the 1960s in the universities. So you really only have one generation max, really, who is trained into this, and the second generation is literally in school age when in the 80s. But I would agree that in the 90s there is obsolescence in that sense because obviously a lot of first of all there's the obsolescence of the general worker in the electronics industry who is putting together stuff, and when the factories close, this is the general story of the industrialization, right? That person was obsolete for the political economic reasons. But a lot of engineers who are definitely dealing with hardware do find some obsolescence, I think. Yeah. This maybe connects to the subjectivity. When you talk to some of these engineers who are now in their 80s, there's about 250 small companies which are left literally in the same building of IZOT, the main central institute, and the factory behind it, which creates computers. And one of the most helpful ones, one who actually set up so many of my other interviews with other people, he definitely talks about obsolescence. Right? Obviously, he's managed to make the transition with a small company, but like he bemoans the fact that, of course, he's not using his own elements. Right? He shows me these patents he made for a robot, and now he's like, we're putting together Chinese components for a French company, that kind of stuff. Right? So he bemoans that obsolescence and that there's a certain subjectivity of his feeling of being born at a time when none of this existed, seeing it promise him literally the stars. He's the one who's very proud of the Soviet space program using Bulgarian computers, and then the fact that it's given him the chance to make a decent life in the 90s and 2000s, but not what he thought was going to happen. He never got into it because of the money anyway, but he got into it because of a certain dream. He talks about national pride as well. So therefore, in that Cold War context, or in the context of the Balkans, I think there is quite a lot of subjectivity about these experiences. And I actually think that's one of the main things I really liked about it, is that no one talks to engineers or people like that and asks them about their own subjectivity. And I remember like all these people from the institute who I talked to, just first of all happy that someone even wants to talk about what they made, but also were just surprised historians think that they had thoughts about the politics and philosophy of it, which of course is stupid. But so there is definitely a lot. The regime itself also was very much aware that this was doing things to the brain potentially, or to even the physical changes, and their large-scale psychological studies which are being done from by the 80s, and they're reported on in both the little magazine for the children, Computer for You, and also in the philosophy journal. And those are not something that you will not read today in the press, right? Anything from eye strain and the effects of carpal tunnel syndrome, which was just being named then, to either addiction for children, like they're going to fall into dream worlds, or massive anxiety about me becoming obsolete. We're going to talk obsolescence, I'm going to be replaced by a robot, or my director is going to see that I don't do any work, which is not something that, is communist or Bulgaria specific in that sense. So I think that the Bulgarian science, computer science, and psychological science in that sense was part of this. I don't know if it's a Cold War story. I think it's just the story of the information age, right? In that sense.
Thank you very much, Victor. I'm super excited, for several things. One, let's start from the behind. In my high school years, I was, sitting behind Pravec 82, and sitting in robotics classes, which is another thing, which you have mentioned. And I think I'm a political scientist, I have nothing to do and no interest, and yet most of our sort of even there was a gender balance into which groups will go parallelki, will go into be familiarized this, and we were moving the robotic arm and so on. So I think you've the reason why I'm starting with this personal story is not only kind of nostalgia or showing the connection to my roots in Sofia, but rather something else. I think first of all, congratulations for your book, because it captures, and your work in general, and there is a reason why I said, I'm quoting you and so on, because there's one chapter that I will comment, for me, from my perspective, is very important, but it shows nuance. it stands so much out of just as you said, a nod to Mary's, kind of like looking at the Balkans as a place, which is, de-orientalized, which has so much richness and nuance inside, that it's almost sometimes a crime, just to package everything and, just think nangro. Here, the nuance for me, and here I'm going to get specific, I believe is chapter 4. And this is the role of state security and state security sort of covert action, if you will, in aiding the industry and switching, as you aptly point out, in differentiation, to a lot of authors, specifically in Bulgaria, and specifically post 89, which went on the train of, kind of denying, kind of the stages of this, project ultimately failed of modernization, but yet, producing other side results. So to me, this nuance is very important because as in my own work, as I quote you, I call it, a limited attempts of innovation, even within the, hopefully this will show up in a chapter very soon, where actually I support your point of view by expressing this importance in nuance. I mean, it takes sometimes, even within this sort of confines of COCOM, right, takes a specific skill, if not braveness, to stand up to KGB and say, well, look, we're going to be pushing our specific civilian, interests first. And then, when you go down all the way to Kostroma, and, Dezeu's famed sort of thing to get out, cash out of the Soviets, that kind of, goes a little bit against this whole thing, like that, yeah, true, but, like 16 Republic, 16 Republic, 16 Republic, yeah, 16 Republic, yet, having its own pathway. And I think Zhivkova and Theodora and other authors and Mary and you are pointing out the nuances that, yes, but there was something very different. So to me, so congratulations on that. The other comment and question, because sorry, you can see that I'm excited, I'm talking a lot. But I think it's so important because it's underreported, under-researched, and you were kind of like the pioneer in showing how a Balkan, agrarian, post-agrarian country, is having this rapid modernization and actually, is able to capture the market inside the socialist bloc. And yet, you were talking about this longue durée, and we're of the generation, I believe, you're probably younger than I am, however, we're the generation which actually, benefited one way or another, I believe, from fascination of Bulgarian education system and the scarcity, because I remember, like the numbers of people per province and, how many people had to be in the computerising club in order to be part of this in school, because you didn't have a private computer or access to it. So I want to hear your comment on what are the real effects on the social capital of the young people, because I think there is a direct relation to the, like exploding industry, post 89 of Bulgarian, STEM, science, and especially programming, and then the outsourcing, which happens until today, I believe, in Sofia. Sorry for this, but it's, I think just like Mary, it will be something that will be, attracting a lot of prizes. So we're looking forward towards the seas.
Thank you again. Like, do you guys want to talk to my mom? Because you'll be great. You'll be just great champions of me. It's like, the state security. So yeah, the general point of the Soviets, I think, and the relationship, the satellite relationship. I'm gonna tackle that one first. I don't know if there was a question, but I just agree, and I think that was one of the major parts of the book for me was constantly like how the tail wags the dog, or who the dog is actually in that sense. And I don't think that's just the Bulgarian story. I think I think probably every country in the Eastern Bloc manages to wag the Soviets in very particular ways. This is just one of the ways that Bulgarians do it, right? There's this famous quote from Zhivkov to the British Prime Minister, British Foreign Minister. Like, we're fine because we have the biggest colony in the world, the USSR, right? And I agree. I think he's very wily in that, and and the 16th Republic and all these political orthodoxy should be seen as precisely what that is. It's cozying up and getting dividends out of it all, right? That is precisely what it is. Of course, obviously, as you well know, in Bulgaria, popular imagination is just as another example of like us being lackeys, etc., and bootlickers. But I don't think that's what is happening, right? I don't know. And the Soviets, first of all, never wanted the 16th Republic. So much trouble that would have been. But Zhivkov knew exactly what had happened, what was he getting. And yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the wider story that, as you say, Theodora, Mary, and people were away from Balkan states are doing. Like, what does it mean to have a superpower backer, right? It's the Russian archives were so fascinating and so they were like when you read the Russian, because I spent a year reading the Bulgarian side of it. When I went to Moscow and saw their counterparts in the Soviets Committee for Science and Progress, they just hated. They hated that they're like, why are we paying these prices for these, quite frankly, not unreliable machines quite often, right? And because they're like, at the Politburo level, everything's been decided. You're paying these prices. And as you well know, in the electronics industry, the Moore's law, right? Like electronics gets twice as powerful but twice as cheap over I can't remember how many years. And of course, so the 5-year plan is perfect because in 1975 the Soviets are paying amazing money for something that's already obsolete, right? Like they're paying such high costs because it's tied to 1970. So yeah, in that sense, yeah, of course, we're getting so much out of it. I know the Poles are trying it. I'm sure all of them are doing it. So okay, the effects. I think you're right. I think that's precisely the thing. It gets back to this idea from Medina. Medina was basically trying to justify, okay, Chile in 1973 when it built the CyberSyn project to automate the Chilean economy has like less than 40 computers. Just because it's lacking doesn't mean that you can't do. They did it for telex machines, but like then doesn't mean that you can't actually do reform, and it doesn't mean that it can't. Create a culture and a capital, right? And that's what I agree. That's maybe I call the story of failure because the factories are gone, but it's not a story of failure because it's precisely a story of success. I do think that there is a critical mass of fascination. I think that if you read the interviews, if you ask some of the people, like the first pioneers of the 90s did start under these computer clubs after all. The push already comes not just from the computer clubs, but from some of the first companies in Bulgaria from 1987 onwards, right? The companies, right? Software enterprises, Bullsofts, Avantgarde, which are set up already before even 1987 by high school students with the help of those unions for creativity, right? Teletme and stuff like that. Yeah. So I think already that generation has already not just cachet, not just like social backing, it has actual economic backing to make that. But yeah, I agree that their leftovers are in STEM, the leftovers are in an extremely good education in this particular side, or at least maybe islands with it. I think the Bulgarian education system by all scores is going down and down and down, right? But there's islands of it. And the fascination which I think is just borne out for the books, for the fact that there's novels, magazines aimed at children, and then obviously actual computer clubs from the 90s, where we all got together to play computer games. So not everybody did that, right? I'm just rambling, but that is, I agree completely with you. Like the hardware was either exported or gone, but this human capital was there. And I think much like why Bulgarians are maybe obsessed with Baba Vanga and obsessed with things is precisely because under socialism, a certain culture was already created, which like fed this into your brain so much. No, I'm not talking about brainwashing. I'm just talking about like it was there. And that's what you consume in many ways, right? There's Baba Vanga, there's the Tumu Pastets, and then there's computers as well. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Two of the people in this Zoom room, Cullen and David, have worked with me on my Baba Vanga project. So we've had long conversations about Baba Vanga.
And probably many more.
In fact, one of the things this is a little bit of a digression, but we found in the archive of the Institute of Socialispedia were these letters to Baba Vanga. So I had Cullen read, it turns out they're Slovak letters from Czechoslovakia, and David looked at some of the ones from the former Yugoslavia to Baba Vanga.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, it's worth a conversation. But
And
I'm kind of
I
interested in
think
like global manga, I guess you could
global
say.
manga, yeah, she's pretty global. And I think didn't they just find some magnetic tapes which are now in the archives? Yeah, they're magnetic like tape recorded tapes, I think. Yeah.
Yes, there's wait, did you guys want to say something, Cullen or David?
Maybe the current grad student goes first. I'll go second. If there's...
Go ahead, Colin. Go ahead.
No. You're unmuted.
Ah, okay. But just super quick. Thank you so much, Victor. I super love reading the book as well. I was curious about the gender aspect and kind of how it might tie in with the socialist systems kind of paternalism. I thought it was pretty interesting about that statement you had said. Well, you can continue breastfeeding while you're working in the mines, and so I thought that was really super interesting about how an industrialized work culture and how that tied in also in the socialist system. Do you ever foresee yourself maybe returning back to look at that, or probably not?
I would if no one's written about it by then, but I am moving away from computers for a foreseeable future. I think I'm very interested in other aspects of science and technology in the region and beyond. But the computer, I think I'm tapped out right now. The gender aspect is, I think someone will pick it up, not necessarily just in the Bulgarian context, but in the socialist context of gender and electronics in that sense, because it's throughout the Eastern Bloc, most of the workers on the conveyor belt is female labor. And there's class dimensions to it. It's not just the women, it's also that at least as one of the engineers here called them, they all smelled of peppers, right? So this kind of class, they were just fresh off the villages, and he's also like, I made these machines and they can't put them together. It's they're to blame for why they don't work. So there's interesting like labor dimensions within the socialist high-tech industries in that sense, which have anything to do with gender, but also like urbanization versus the rural areas and views of peasantry and etc. And I agree completely. Like, it's only been recently written about in the Western, computer history stuff. Mark Hicks has this amazing book called Programmed Inequality about why Britain, which created the computer by the 60s, was basically lost to the USA as computing power. And their main argument is that, it's precisely because of the sidelining of the female engineers and the female software specialists, so technicians, right? So if that's a pioneering book, but it's for the last 5 years in the Western context, while the Eastern computing context is just so bare that I think someone will pick this up and hopefully do it across the Eastern Bloc. Yeah. Or you can do it. I don't know. Someone should do it.
I think Cullen had a comment, Kirill, or a question.
Yes, absolutely.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. This is really interesting. I came across this book a few years ago, Gaming the Iron Curtain. I figured you'd heard of this if you were writing about computers in the Eastern Bloc. And I really liked that book, but I always wondered if he'd ever thought about the global context of it, because before 68, Czechoslovakia kind of was also the bestest satrapy, like the little good friend who did a lot of the global South outreach in computing. And then when he's talking about these computer clubs more during normalization in the 70s and 80s, he never mentions exporting it. And I've kind of thought, I have a half-baked idea to think about how that shifted in the 60s. And you mentioned earlier that Bulgaria was thinking about the Czechs and the Germans and then passed them at some point. How conscious was that interbloc dynamic? And once Bulgaria had passed the other countries, did they try to return, or was it kind of Bulgaria's there and we're here to stay?
Oh no, this is when you speak to the Bulgarian people, Bulgarian engineers, they're it was constant national battle in this Comic-Con meetings and when you read the files, it's obvious the Czechs say this, the Hungarians say this, and everyone's fighting for a piece. Everyone did have a piece of the pie from the start. Pretty much every country outside of Romania had a participation in this unified system of computers, right? They were creating at least one type of processor in each country. They're creating other things like robots of their own or displays. So there was always a constant competition. And by the late 80s, Bulgaria is very much aware that with Gorbachev and the coming of Gorbachev and the need to modernize to the next stage of computing, that's what which they won could well very easily be lost, right? They were top of the pile, maybe in that world of the late 60s to the early 80s, but they were very much aware that the next stage would take a lot of hard cash again, right? And a lot of vision. And the Czechs and the Germans and everyone was very much aware of that as well, right? And Charles Meyer, for example, in this book, Dissolution, already has a whole chapter, I think, chapter 2 on how Robotron, the East German computer combines, attempt in the 80s to create high-tech industry and basically become the people in the Eastern Bloc, has a direct result to the financial destruction of the GDR, right? So like Robotron, obviously everyone is trying to like fight everybody else. Comic-Con is supposed to be about mutual aid, but yeah, so I would say, yeah, and Charles Mayer's argument is precisely something like this, like these high-tech industries is what Robotron is trying by the 80s, let's say. So I'm sure I think the Czechs are doing that. Videotron in Hungary is doing the same, you know. And I think the Bulgarians are very much aware by 87, 88 that the jump is gonna come, and let's say we might not be this anymore, you know. And actually, I think in Bulgarian case also it contributes to the financial crisis, the last financial debt crisis, because they're trying quite often the personal computers that they're building by the 80s to fulfill the quotas which the domestic or these German elements base can't fulfill. They have to go to Taiwan and Singapore and buy the elements, which means you're paying scarce dollars for elements which you're only going to get rubles back for, which is the complete opposite idea of what the whole industry is really supposed to be doing, you know.
What was that name that you said again of the author writing on combat?
Charles Meyer. Meyer, he wrote
Meyer.
Dissolution. Yeah, Dissolution. I think it's a book from the 90s now, I think. But it's still very influential, I think, arguments in the whole idea of the linkages between not just electronics but high technology and the fall of the regimes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. One last, Mary, if you allow me, quick comment. Since Victor said, like I understand, if he says that he's burned out right now, from computers and so, but I would love to read, his thoughts on something larger, which he already mentioned, and I hope he has plans on doing so. And this is the creation of what I would call the techno-intelligentsia, to begin with, but also the privileged managerial class as it emerges, at least in my field, in transition, which actually, is kind of like the new princely class, if you will. So it kind of nicely ties, with what you were talking about, the class dimension about, people coming, in Stara Zagora or in Sofia to work, on the assembly lines, mainly females, smelling of paprika or garlic, that's pretty, telling about what the engineering, the princely class is thinking about everybody else, and the desire and the social dynamic actually to join these particular industries as opposed to, more traditional, I don't know, mining, manufacturing, and, everything that's there. What I think, however, there is a larger theme, I'm not sure whether it's been explored, or hopefully Victor will explore, at least for the Bulgarian case, if not regional, is what role these people play into the transition in the early years in democracy. Because as you were familiar, with this really heated debate, right, about what happens, after, some of those, and some Bulgarian authors, of course, are very vocal in this. What happens, with the foreign entities that are being registered, where has the money has gone, what are the careers of these regular engineers versus people in the top of Politburo and so on, but look at from very different perspective, not the usual kind of stuff that we are seeing, like as I mentioned, 16th Republic, I think that in history as well, we're seeing a little bit of a patterning, right, of repetitive kind of thinking without nuance. I'm quite if I recollect well, just looking at the history of how even Videoton, came later to Stara Zagora, from Hungary and so on, all of this dynamic actually shows that there is more, at least to me, than what it meets the eye, and the sensation is kind of like black and white, like kind of swinging binary between 1 or 0, right? It was just, especially the first years, after 89 were really kind of ideologically driven, right? And it's just bad, like, let's forget about this. It doesn't matter. So going beyond that point, and looking at what really, what kind of social dimension that, this modernization and specifically in STEM, again, I'm tying back, Victor, to my older idea about the social capital, because I don't see it necessarily as failure. There's a reason why the outsourcing industry, like all of a sudden, and until today in Sofia, like there is this, like rural urban divide where people are like, oh yeah, the IT people with the large salaries in Sofia, and us, the real country. So on. So it's interesting because it all ties down to what Siberia is explaining, like the roots are there, whether we like it or not, it's factual.
Yeah, I agree. And I've toyed with the idea of writing a history of the information age behind the Iron Curtain, like that subset of the whole Iron Curtain, because and precisely for that, because I think it's the technical intelligentsia, that sort of that appears in the 70s and is so transnationally mobile or intellectually mobile, that's really interesting. And there's touching points in institutes, in business deals, in licenses, negotiations, but I'm not sure I have the interest right now, or at least right now it's fallen by the wayside. But I agree that that is something that has to be done, and the scientific technical intelligence has to be taken seriously as a group. And it seems to be that all the literature used to, and maybe like Cold War literature used to, and now it's like forgotten. Like after communism fell, so their technology was crap and their scientific elites were terrible or something, and then we don't have to talk about it anymore, which is obviously not what's true. But it seems like the literature and history is, of course, doesn't talk about it. I know, and I would love someone to take that job off my hands.
Victor,
yeah.
you pointed out something, and I really stopped, but you said something very important. This is why, I love those conversations with Mary, with people like you, it's like a little bit to talk about Soviet science and, like hard science, and mathematics and so on, like all of a sudden it goes like this, right? Like, and then it's cut, it should be crap. And it's impossible to be this way, right? Like life is much more complex and nuanced than that. It can be either or, especially when we talk about STEM, right?
No,
Because this is kind of like the bottom line of it, like, which is not necessarily open to interpretation. And I'm not saying that it's not important, but like in mathematics, right? It's pretty exact. So,
there's a reason the Silicon Valley ate all of the Bulgarians, the Poles, the Hungarians, everyone. The Russians, the Ukrainians. Of course, they ate them up for very particular reasons. And I want to go back to the thing about just the technical intelligentsia today, or the urban-rural divide. I totally agree. Of course, it has in life down to now, and I could even see it. I think some of the political programs of certain parties, which I think that even though they're completely anti-communist, they're not on the left at all. This dream of computers and now being translated into digital governance and transparency will solve the current problems of corruption and low productivity, right? So it's almost like Bulgarian politicians have this obsession with computing as the panacea for something. And even though they hate being called like, oh, the communists told the same, just in a different way. They don't. I found out they don't like being told that. So, but I think it carries over. So. I just want to say, if I don't know how many minutes we have, but the book is open access as well, which is I think very
that's
important.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I hope everyone will read this excellent book. I mean, I have reams more questions, but there's going to be a book panel at this year's ACES on Victor's book, and I'm on the panel along with Teodora Dragostinova. And is there anyone else on that panel?
Elidor Mahili.
Oh, Elidor Mahili. Yay.
And Joe Massimo from
Yeah, so if anyone listening is going to ACES and wants to hear more discussion of the book, I think it's going to be really exciting. But thank you so much, Victor, for this. I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed the conversation. So we'll be following your work in the future, and you and I need to talk about Baba Vanga.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the audience. It's Friday. Thank you, for braving, because you said that you're in Sofia, so I assume it's late in the evening. And we're inviting you to come and be an audience for the incoming speakers. We do have
Mhm.
really serious and interesting, speakers coming still. So thank you for being part of Balkan Circle.